Hi, this is Mrs. Compton, and we're going to talk today about storytelling. So, the last piece of the puzzle for everything we've talked about with Africa and Asia and Latin America is the idea of the oral tradition, and that is storytelling. So, if you want to grab some notes, I have a few things that I'd like you to take down. You've already watched the video from Ira Glass, and he talked about the different pieces of a story. So we're going to talk a little bit about why storytelling is so important. We'll go through the pieces of what a story has to have, and you'll be telling your own stories later in the week, or actually at the beginning of next week. And you want to think about what story you want to tell, and I have a few tips in terms of the verbal and nonverbal as you tell those stories. So just a few things to get down in your notes that we'll use as we go through this week. If you haven't watched the video from Ira Glass, you want to hop on Blackboard and do that first. Feel free to pause at any point so that you can get those notes complete. So, the first thing we want to talk about is how a storytelling culture is built. This really ties very closely with Africa, but all cultures have storytelling as part of their background. So every culture that either exists today or has been known to exist in the past had a strong storytelling culture, something that was all their own, shaped by the people. So if you think about it, here in the United States, we have stories that have been passed down through the ages, going as far back as Native American folk tales. In English 11, you will read Native American folk tales, and you've already read some African folk tales. So there are stories that get passed down, and not just stories that are fictional, but stories that are tied to their religious beliefs, or even historical stories, things that are tied to what happened in the past that led to who they are now. Stories are used for entertainment, so we just tell stories because they're fun. We use stories to teach. I always think the best teachers are ones that can turn a lesson into a story, because those tend to stick in your head a little bit better. And for passing on old knowledge and wisdom, so that hopefully you don't make the same mistakes that people have made in the past. If you think about it, you probably tell stories all the time. You tell stories at your locker when you get to school in the morning and you see your friends. Your friends are telling you stories all of the time. Over the holidays, as you saw your family, they were telling stories either about the past or things that are happening to them. We use stories all the time. The different stories or different ways of telling the same stories shape our distinct culture. So basically, your culture's stories become part of your self-identity. And so some of those stories, if you think about yeah, as Americans, some of those stories are things like, George Washington crossing the Potomac River and the Civil War and things that are part of our history, but they're also part of our family. That's a big part of why storytelling is so important. So the stories that your parents tell you or your grandparents tell you or your aunts and uncles, the things that your friends, the stories that you and your friends share, all those things shape who you are as a person. And if you were born in a different time or in a different place, where you are at, those stories create who you are. So it is believed that stories are kind of the core base of who we are as individuals. It's how we share ideas, it's how we pass on knowledge, it's how we teach our young children. We use stories to teach. So stories have a really important purpose in our lives. And if you listen closely over the next week, chances are you will hear people telling stories all the time, whether they're short or long, whether they're tied to something that happened the last hour or the last week or years ago. We tell stories all the time. It's just who we are as people. So, what elements make up a good story? So, Ira Glass kind of outlined three pieces that I'm going to ask that you have in your story. The first part is the anecdote. So, you need to have a sequence of events or some kind of action. You can explain the events in as much detail as you would like, but you know that you have to have one thing happening to the next, happening to the next. And you want to plan that out because some people have a tendency to go off on tangents when they tell stories. So, you want to make sure you have your sequence clear. You also want to make sure that you have enough detail. Sometimes we don't include enough detail, and the listener is wondering, who is that person, or why are you there, or where are we at? So you want to make sure that you have good detail. So you're going to plan out that sequence of events. And the sequence then is naturally going to build some suspense as people wonder what's going to happen next. And you want to think about that as you're building your sequence of events. So that last part ties into the second point, that you need to make sure that you're raising a question within the listener's mind. So it's basically called bait. So what kind of questions does the audience have that's going to keep them interested in listening to your story? So maybe it's just a question of what's going to happen next, or why did he have that in his backpack, or who is that person? How is that person going to play into the story? We really have no idea what the audience is actually thinking. These are not literal questions that you're going to ask throughout your story, but you just want to want to have some ideas that keep your some ideas that are going to keep your audience thinking, and just putting yourself in your audience's shoes and seeing, like, are they going to be interested in this story, or am I giving away too much at the beginning that then doesn't lead them to the end? So it's just something to think about as you're writing your story or putting your story together. And then finally, we want to end with a moment of reflection. So that's basically making sure that your story has a point. It's the reason why you're telling the story in the first place. Is it because you learned something, or it's something that you don't want other people to do because it was a dumb mistake on your part? Maybe it's just something really interesting that you want to share, a place that you've been, because you think that they should visit that place too. So there's lots of different reasons to have a moment of reflection. And again, you're not going to literally say, the reason I'm telling you this story is because everybody gets different moments of reflections out of stories, because we all have different life experiences. So the lesson that I get out of a story is probably going to be very different than what you get out of a story, because I've lived, twice as long as you have. So the moment of reflection is not literally stated, but you do want to make sure you have a purpose in telling your story, even if it's just, this is something really interesting that happened to me that you might want to try too, or you might want to avoid. We'll talk more about that moment of reflection as you write your story. So those are the 3 pieces that you're going to make sure you think about as you put your story together. And you're not going to write out your story word for word and read it to the other members. You're going to tell your story in a small group to the people in your small group. You're going to just have little notes to follow, because when we tell stories, we just talk. And so you're just going to talk and tell your story, and you can use whatever notes you want to tell your story, but you're not going to write it out, because that's then reading your story, not telling your story. And that's what I want you to do. So those are the building blocks. The next part to think about, and we'll come back to this idea, I just want you to get into your notes now, is that effective delivery. So we're going to talk about the vocal cues, the things that come out of your mouth, and the nonverbal cues that are the things your body does. So just some things to think about with the vocal cues, and there are a ton of vocal cues, and we'll come back to this second semester as we do more public speaking, but just a few to start thinking about. Volume. When you're speaking in front of the classroom, you want to make sure you're heard in the back of the room. You're going to be speaking with a small group of people, so you just want to make sure you can be heard by everybody in your small group. When we have 6, 7, 8 small groups talking at the same time, you just want to make sure that you're loud enough that you can be heard, but not that you're so loud that you're disrupting other groups. So just be careful of that volume, too soft or too loud. Think about your tone. If it's a happy piece or a sad piece, you want to make sure your tone is appropriate. So you're not smiling and excited while you talk about your dog dying, okay? At the same time, you want to actually, if you went on a cool trip to Puerto Vallarta, you want to be excited about that and happy about that. So make sure your tone is appropriate to the mood of your piece. Think about your inflection. You do not have to do this, but in the past I've had a few people who changed their voices for the different people in their story, their crazy uncle or their best friend. It's just something kind of fun to do. At the very least, you want to make sure that you have some up and down to your voice. So we naturally, when we talk, have some inflection. You just want to make sure that you're not monotone, because that's very difficult to listen to as an audience member. Watch for quickness in your rate. I'm a naturally fast talker. Up in the north, we tend to be a little quicker talkers. So just watch, especially when you're kind of nervous, that you're not talking too fast. So I consciously have to tell myself to slow down, and I don't often do a good job of that. Rate is something that I am always thinking about. So if you're a quick talker, just be aware that sometimes that's hard for people to follow. So you want to go ahead and make sure that you pause or at least slow down those ideas so they can follow your story. Remember that to help that rate, it's okay to pause. We sometimes want to always fill our space with noise. I'm doing it right now by kind of slowing down to think about what I'm going to say next. And it's okay to pause and let people just think about what you've said. Let them digest it, and then move on. So if you don't remember what comes next in your story, or you need a moment to just think about what you're going to say next, it's okay to pause. Chances are your audience isn't even going to notice that you paused, because they're thinking about your story, and it gives you time to reflect and think about what you want to say next. Silence then helps you to avoid non-word sounds. I'm a big fan of using I shouldn't say I'm a fan, but I use a lot. You'll hear it now as I'm talking through the rest of this presentation. See, I just did it. I say a lot. Other people say ah or or any number of non-word sounds. Some people also use filler words. Like is a big one for the teenage generation. Like, I used to say all the time when I was a teenager. And once you realize that you have these filler words, like right now I'm thinking about constantly, we have a tendency then to help break that pattern. And instead of saying I need to just pause and think about the word I want to say next. So just think about all those little pieces in our vocal delivery. In terms of the nonverbal, that's what you're doing with your body. So eye contact. You want to make sure that you're looking around to everybody in your audience. In this case, it's going to be the people in your small group. Don't forget the people to the left and right of you. So you're not just telling your story to the people sitting directly across from you. So look around to everybody. Think about your posture. Stand tall if you're standing. Sit tall if you're sitting. Just make sure you're not slouching, because that's not attractive for anybody to look at. It also doesn't help your air. Those of you who have been in choir, or maybe in your music classes, your teacher probably talked about making sure you're nice and tall so that your diaphragm is straight, and then you can have good air in your lungs to help support your voice. So posture is always very important in a presentation. Smile. It helps you to relax, and it maintains a positive tone. Customer service representatives over the phone are told to smile, because when you smile, it comes across as being a happier tone. So when you're on the phone for a job interview, if you have a phone interview first, make sure you're smiling, because that happy tone comes through in your voice. So unless, again, you're talking about, the day that your dog died, you want to make sure that you have probably a more positive tone, and a smile can help with that. For gestures, use whatever feels comfortable. You can't see me right now, but I am totally using my hand as I talk, because I just talk with my hands all the time. And you'll realize that, or you've probably seen that as I present in front of the class. I'm just a hand talker. And if you use gestures, that's fine. Use whatever feels comfortable. But if you just want to have your hands in your lap, or your hands holding onto a note card, that is just fine. So do whatever feels comfortable for you. Don't feel like you have to use gestures just because it's something that you can do when you're telling a story. Confidence is that intangible thing that I just can't teach. And confidence is something that comes with practice and feeling comfortable with your story. So with this presentation, I have done this assignment with storytelling for both juniors and seniors, upperclassmen, and with freshmen. I've done it for about 4 years, and I will ask you at the end of your story to reflect on what went well and what you could do better. And every single year, even though I'm telling you this right now, I have students say in their reflection they wish they would have told their story a few more times in practice, so that they felt better telling their story the day of. Because we think it's kind of weird to practice our story on our own, to tell it to a mirror, or to tell it to a friend, or to just sit in our bedroom and tell it to the air. We think that's weird. And it is. It's not natural. But when you do that, you're able to go through your story a few more times, and you know what pieces you like and what you want to take out. And every time you tell your story, it's going to be a little bit different. It's never going to be exactly the same. So the more times you tell it, the more you'll see what you like about the story and what you want to change about the story. And you'll feel better when you come into the classroom and have to sit down and tell your story. Because I'm going to be making those groups, and I'm going to stick you with people that you don't normally hang out with. And I want you to feel comfortable in telling that story. So practice, practice, practice is going to make you feel better. We'll practice in class at least twice, so you'll get to go through your story at least 2 times, and then you'll give the story for real the next day. So you want to make sure you feel confident in your story, so please practice on your own at home, because that confidence is going to come through. And make sure you take a deep breath and exhale before you start. Don't feel like you have to jump right in and start rolling with your story. Feel free, they'll wait for you. Take a moment to compose your thoughts, take a deep breath and settle your mind. It's kind of yoga-ish, but do that, and I guarantee you're going to feel better as you start your story, and you're going to have a better story in the end. So a few tips from me to you. You might want to memorize the opening lines of your story. We'll start working on our story in class in tomorrow, I believe. And so my suggestion as you start to put the story together is to think about what your opening line is going to be, and that'll help you have a strong start. I'm not telling you to write out the entire story, but you might want to write out the first line or two just so you know how you want to start. Same thing with the ending. Make sure you have a definite ending, and you might want to memorize those lines too, so that you don't have some kind of rambling ending and you're not quite sure how you want to end. You just know that you have to, and then you don't feel like you have a strong ending. Also, think about your audience. These are people who don't necessarily know you very well. So how much detail do they need? Do they need to know who different people are? Do they need to know what the setting is? Do they need to know any background or history before going into the story or during the story? But at the same time, make sure you're not telling 5 stories in one. So it's a delicate line to cross, where you're telling a story with detail and depth so people can follow the information, but not too much, more than they need, which is a fine line for some people. Realize what audiences want. all audiences, they want to be able to hear, follow, and understand a story. We love hearing stories because we like putting our imagination to work and thinking about, what was it like? What did it look like when you were up north and you were, water skiing for the first time? And they want to have fun or experience some other strong feeling. That's why we like reading books and we like watching movies and we like watching TV shows. We all love hearing stories, whether it's our own stories, that we like telling, or it's listening to the stories of our friends or our family, or the stories that are made up, fictional stories, or stories that are historic. All audiences want to hear and understand a story. We like putting our imaginations to work. We like experiencing other situations that haven't happened to us. So realize that the people that are listening to your story, they're going to want to listen to it. We all like hearing the stories of other people. And so know that you have a great story to tell. So start thinking now about the story that you might want to tell the class, something that's happened to you in the past. We'll brainstorm some ideas together as a class, but start thinking about things that have happened to you. It does need to be a story that you are intimately involved in, something that has happened to you that you've done in your life. So start thinking now about that, and we'll be brainstorming some ideas tomorrow. The next thing that you're going to do is head to Blackboard, and I have a story for you to listen to. There's a program called The Moth, and it's The Moth Storytelling, and they actually go all around the country and have these events. Sometimes they're in Milwaukee at the Pabst Theater, and people just go up and tell their stories, and they have different themes that people tell stories about. So they have a website I'm going to send you to, and I'm going to have you listen to a story. As you listen to that story, take a look at the notes sheet. You can recreate that in your notebook, or you can print it out, whatever you would like to do. You could just recreate it in your notebook, and you're going to practice writing out the sequence of events. So what's happening in that story? What questions do you have as you're going through the story? And what do you see as the moment of reflection? And I'm going to ask you to submit that on Blackboard. This is what you're going to do when you listen to the stories of your classmates. So it's just a little bit of practice now, and it's a chance for you to hear a story before we start telling our stories. So go ahead and go to Blackboard, and you can do that next step. Thanks.